Chapter 1. A family like any other. On a quiet, sun-drenched street in Perris, California, the Turpin family home stood as a monument to the ordinary. To the casual observer, it was just another suburban residence. Beige stucco, a manicured lawn, and a two-car garage. But looking closer, the signs of a strictly private life were there. The curtains were always drawn tight, even on the brightest afternoons. The 13 children were rarely seen playing outside, and when they were, it was often at odd hours, their movements synchronized and quiet. Some neighbors later recalled fleeting glimpses of pale faces waving from darkened windows in the middle of the night. Others remembered nothing at all, because David and Louise Turpin worked tirelessly to remain invisible. For years, behind those walls, they constructed a household governed by absolute secrecy, rigid ritual, and total control. This wasn't a family that simply valued privacy, it was a fortress of isolation. And the truth of what was happening inside didn't come to light through a concerned teacher, a local doctor, or a visiting relative. It came to light because one teenager decided that waiting to be rescued was no longer an option. She realized that survival meant breaking the silence, no matter the cost. Chapter 2. Sandcastle Day School. To the state of California, the Turpin children were not missing. They were students. They were officially enrolled at the Sandcastle Day School, a private institution where David Turpin himself was registered as the principal. It was a school that existed only on paper, yet it provided a powerful legal shield. In California, the regulations governing private homeschooling can be surprisingly minimal. There were no routine inspections, no mandated curriculum reviews, and no outside eyes to verify the well-being of the students. In practice, this registration created a vacuum, a legal structure that kept the children entirely off the radar of the social systems designed to protect them. Later reporting and harrowing court records revealed a devastating reality. Several of the older children, some of whom were already well into their 30s, had received only the most basic, minimal education. Some could barely read or write. The isolation wasn't just a byproduct of their lifestyle, it was a calculated strategy enabled by a systemic loophole. As long as the paperwork was filed, the state had no reason to look behind the front door. The Sandcastle Day School was not a place of learning, it was a place of hiding. To truly understand the gravity of the Turpin case, one must look at the long, grueling timeline of their movements. Before the family settled in Perris, they lived in Fort Worth, Texas, and later in Rio Vista. In each location, they repeated the same pattern of isolation. They were a family that moved in the shadows of the night. Neighbors in Texas recalled seeing the children marching in circles inside the house for hours, a bizarre ritual of exercise that kept them from being seen outdoors. They were instructed to remain silent, to avoid eye contact, and to never speak to anyone outside the immediate family. The psychological conditioning was absolute. David and Louise Turpin didn't just lock doors, they locked minds. They created a shared reality where the outside world was a place of eternal damnation, and their home, no matter how abusive, was the only sanctuary. This deep-seated fear was reinforced through selective use of religious texts, twisted to justify their cruelty as a form of divine discipline. The children were told they were sinners who needed to be purified through deprivation. It was a cult of two, with 13 victims. We must consider the sheer endurance required to survive such an environment for decades. The older siblings essentially raised the younger ones, providing the only source of genuine human connection in a house defined by its absence. They shared whispered stories of a future they could barely imagine, keeping each other's spirits alive through the darkest years. This internal bond was the one thing the parents could never fully break. Even as they were chained to furniture, the siblings found ways to communicate, to share hope, and to eventually, collectively, decide that the cycle had to end. The bravery of Jordan was not just an individual act, it was the culmination of years of shared resilience. It was the moment the collective strength of 13 children finally outweighed the control of 2 adults. Understanding this history is essential to grasping why the escape was so difficult and why the recovery is so complex. It wasn't just about leaving a house, it was about deconstructing a lifetime of psychological warfare. Chapter 3. What the walls held. When investigators finally stepped across the threshold of the Perris home, they were met with conditions that shocked even the most veteran officers. They found a house that was physically clean in some areas, but psychologically and physically oppressive in ways that are difficult to fathom. This was a world of extreme deprivation and systematic neglect. The record is heavy with documentation, court filings, law enforcement statements, and deeply researched reporting that details the use of chains and padlocks to restrain the children for weeks or even months at a time. They were often denied basic hygiene, allowed to shower only once a year, and fed only one meal a day while their parents ate well in front of them. In this film, we choose not to reimagine those rooms in graphic detail. The facts speak loudly enough. What truly matters is understanding the pattern of power, a system where control was always framed as discipline, and where extreme isolation was presented to the children as a form of protection from a wicked outside world. For year after agonizing year, this pattern went unchallenged, hidden in plain sight. Chapter 4: The Escape. The end of the Turpin nightmare began with a plan that took 2 years to conceive. Two sisters, living in a state of constant fear, began to plot their way out. They knew the risks were absolute. On the night of January 14th, 2018, the moment finally arrived. They climbed through a window, escaping the only world they had ever known. One of the sisters, overwhelmed by the sheer terror of the unknown, turned back. But Jordan, who was 17 at the time, kept going. She wasn't just running for her life, she was running for the lives of her 12 siblings. In her hand, she clutched a deactivated cell phone, a device with no service, but one that could still reach emergency services if she could find a Wi-Fi signal. When she finally reached a dispatcher, her voice was trembling but clear. She reported the abuse, her age, and the fact that some of her siblings were physically restrained at that very moment. When the police met her on the street, she showed them the only evidence she had: photographs stored on that old phone. Those images were the first cracks in the wall of secrecy that had stood for decades. It was the moment the world finally looked inside. Let us dwell for a moment on the sensory reality of that January night in 2018. Imagine the silence of a suburban street, broken only by the sound of a window sliding open. For Jordan, the world outside that window was a terrifying expanse of the unknown. She had spent 17 years within a controlled environment where every move was monitored and every thought was dictated. Stepping out onto the pavement was an act of profound courage that most people will never have to summon. The air was cold, the shadows were long, and every distant siren or barking dog likely felt like a personal threat. She was carrying a deactivated phone, a plastic relic that represented her only link to a world she had been told was evil. The physical sensation of the wind, the texture of the grass, the vastness of the night sky, these were all new experiences. She wasn't just walking down a street, she was navigating a different dimension. As she walked, she had to battle the deep-seated urge to turn back, the voice of her parents that had been internalized over nearly 2 decades. Every step away from the house was a step toward a possible death, according to the narrative she had been fed. Yet, the memory of her younger siblings, some still chained, provided the fuel for her journey. This was not a cinematic escape. It was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying walk toward the truth. When she finally encountered the police, her inability to articulate her own address or the ages of her siblings was not a sign of confusion, but a direct result of her total isolation. She had been kept in a state of perpetual childhood, denied the most basic information about her own life. That she was able to communicate at all is a miracle of the human mind's refusal to be crushed. As we listen to this account, we should try to hold that image of a lone teenager in the dark, armed only with a broken phone and a desperate hope. It is the most powerful image in this entire saga, a single spark of light that eventually brought the entire house of horrors into the glare of public scrutiny. It reminds us that even in the most absolute darkness, the instinct for freedom can never be completely extinguished. It is the core of our humanity, the part of us that insists on being seen, being heard, and being free. Chapter 5: The Reckoning. The response was immediate. David and Louise Turpin were arrested that same night, their reign of control ending in the glare of police flashlights. The legal process that followed was swift by comparison to the decades of abuse. In February 2019, faced with the overwhelming evidence and the testimony of their own children, they pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts, including cruelty to a dependent adult, child cruelty, and false imprisonment. They were sentenced to 25 years to life, ensuring they would likely spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Legally, the Turpin case reached a definitive conclusion. But for the 13 siblings, the sentencing was not the end of the story. It was merely the close of one horrific chapter and the beginning of a much longer, more complicated journey toward recovery. They were stepping into a world they didn't understand, carrying scars that no court order could heal. Chapter 6: Rescued into Another House. This is the part of the Turpin story that rarely makes it into the sensationalized headlines. It is the story of a second betrayal. In April 2018, several of the youngest siblings, having just been rescued from their parents, were placed into the care of foster parents Marcelino and Rosa Olguin. It was supposed to be a safe harbor. Instead, it became another house of horrors. Years later, investigators substantiated claims of physical and emotional abuse within the Olguin home. Some of the children, who had just escaped decades of trauma, were subjected to further harm by the very system that claimed to be their savior. The Olguins eventually pleaded guilty in 2024, but the damage was done. An independent report commissioned by Riverside County later described the situation in stark terms. The Turpin siblings were failed twice. First, by the parents who should have loved them, and second, by a foster care system that failed to properly vet and monitor their placement. It is a sobering reminder that rescue is not always the same as safety. As we reflect on the aftermath of the case, it is vital to examine the systemic vulnerabilities that allowed this to persist for so long. The Sandcastle Day School was a symptom of a much larger issue: the tension between parental rights and the state's responsibility to protect children. In the United States, the right to homeschool is fiercely protected, and for many families, it is a successful and positive choice. However, in the Turpin case, this right was weaponized. The lack of meaningful oversight meant that once a child was withdrawn from the public system, they effectively became invisible to the state. There were no triggers for welfare checks, no requirements for standardized testing that might have flagged developmental delays, and no mandatory health screenings. The children's medical records were non-existent for years. This creates a dangerous black hole where abuse can thrive undetected. Beyond the legal loopholes, there is the social aspect of minding one's own business. Several people over the years noticed the children's unusual appearance, their gaunt frames, their outdated clothing, and their fearful demeanors. Yet, the fear of being wrong or overstepping social boundaries often prevents intervention. We must ask ourselves what our collective responsibility is to the vulnerable in our communities. The Turpin case serves as a haunting reminder that silence is often a form of complicity. Since the case broke, there have been renewed calls for Jordan's Law, proposed legislation that would mandate more rigorous check-ins for homeschooling families, particularly those with a history of social service contact. While these debates continue, the siblings themselves are the living testimony to the need for change. Their lives are no longer defined by the beige walls in Perris, but by their ongoing journey to find their voices in a world that once ignored them. They are now advocates for their own futures, proving that while a system may fail, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity to seek the light. The story of the Turpin family is not just a dark chapter in criminal history. It is a call to action for better protections, more vigilant communities, and a commitment to ensuring that no child is ever truly invisible again. We owe it to the survivors to learn these lessons and to ensure that their suffering leads to a safer world for others. Chapter 7. Closing. The Turpin case is frequently framed as a story about two uniquely cruel and twisted individuals. While that is true, focusing only on the parents misses the larger, more systemic lesson. This is also a story about every checkpoint and every safety net that should have caught them, but failed. It is a story about a homeschooling process that allowed children to vanish into thin air. It is a story about neighbors and relatives who suspected something was wrong, but didn't feel empowered to intervene. And it is a story about a broken foster system that allowed survivors to be re-victimized. Today, some of the siblings are rebuilding their lives. They are pursuing educations, finding jobs, and discovering what it means to be free. Their strength is the true legacy of this case. And it all began because one teenager, on a cold January night in 2018, looked at the window and chose the terrifying risk of freedom over the slow death of silence.